A military demarcation line cuts through the middle of the Korean peninsula. Steel barbed wire spans the entire distance, dividing North and South Korea. The demilitarized zone symbolizes bitter grievances on both sides of the border. The DMZ represents war, destruction, division, and confrontation. However, the DMZ shall also be a place where a new public will emerge. A new public of the nation and the humanity that try to realize peace, life, communication, and coexistence emerge. DMZ, breeding ground for peace, life, and unification. At the end of World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union occupied the Korean peninsula under the guise of disarming the Japanese army. The two superpowers decided to divide Korea at the 38th parallel, which tore apart the nation. Those who do not learn the lessons of history are doomed to repeat it. How did Korea succumb to Japan and become its colony? Korea is a peninsula that neighboring nations have sought to control because its geographical location would allow them to pursue an expansionist policy on both land and sea. At the turn of the 20th century, Western nations were expanding their power, but Korea's Joseon Kingdom did little to strengthen security and defenses. With rampant internal fighting and corruption in the royal court, it allowed encroaching foreign powers and subsequently fell under the control of Japan. After Korea gained its independence, the country repeated the mistakes it had made in the past. The United States and the Soviet Union divided the Korean peninsula at the 38th parallel as part of a long-term struggle between two ideologies, capitalism and communism. To the north, Kim Il-sung came into power, while in the south, Syngman-rhee came into power. In 1948, the general election for a new Korean government under the UN-brokered agreement was canceled. Kim Il-sung and Syngman-rhee each announced their own government, splintering the nation into two. Kim Gu and Kim Gyu-sik, who bravely fought for Korea's independence during the Japanese occupation, found themselves attacked on both sides for being moderates. The day of Japan's defeat was also the day that brought independence, but the nation plunged into a civil war. The Korean War inflicted immeasurable pain and suffering to the country. Total casualties are estimated at over 4.8 million lives. More than half of those who died were civilians. The war begat 300,000 war widows, 100,000 orphan children, 3.2 million refugees, and 10 million people separated from their families. 80% of the country's infrastructure, 45% of the industrial sector, and 75% of all government facilities were destroyed. More than half of all homes were either destroyed or damaged. The Civil War tore apart the nation. As the brutality and unbridled violence of war continued, national division became consolidated. Anti-communism and anti-Americanism reached new heights, leading to a deep-set hatred and confrontation. After fighting for 37 months, an armistice agreement was signed on July 27, 1953. The war frontline at the time of the signing was chosen as the Military Demarcation Line, or the Truce Line. The line starts from the mouth of the Imjin River and goes all the way to Myeongholi. Altogether 1,292 posts, each separated by 200 meters, were staked to the ground. The total length of this truce line is 248 kilometers, or 155 miles. Under the armistice agreement, both sides are supposed to keep a distance of 2 kilometers from the ceasefire line. So the width of this area was set at 4 kilometers, and this area is the demilitarized zone, the DMZ. But because the hastily drawn truce agreement left out many particulars and mistrust between two Koreas was deep, the rule banning heavy weapons in the DMZ has been broken from the beginning. In the 2-kilometer-wide swath of the DMZ belonging to North Korea, there are mortars and anti-tank guns in position. 354 North Korean military posts also lie within this area, in addition to landmine fields. On the south side, there are also 100 military guard posts, concrete barriers, and military camps along the DMZ. In addition, both North and South Koreas have moved the barbed wire fence on their sides a little closer to the military demarcation line. Thus, the width of the DMZ is currently less than 4 kilometers. While most people figure that the fence line is the military demarcation line, that is not so. It is the southern limit line of the DMZ, which is actually 2 kilometers to the south of the military demarcation line. And the DMZ area includes the actual demilitarized zone, the area inside the civilian control line south of the DMZ and its vicinity where local people reside. The civilian control line keeps civilians out for the sake of military exercises and operations. But farmers who own or lease the land within the line are allowed to enter or live inside. The area south of the DMZ's southern limit line but north of the civilian control line is designated as the Civilian Control Zone, having a total area of 1,528 square kilometers at the time of the Armistice Agreement. This area stretches 10 kilometers to the south of the military demarcation line. Even though Korean troops guard the military demarcation line on the south side, Korea has no jurisdiction over the DMZ. The Armistice Agreement was signed by North Korea and China on one side, and the United Nations forces on the other. Vowing to reunify the nation by force, the Syngman Rhee administration was adamantly against the Armistice Agreement at the time. That is why today Korean soldiers must receive permission from the UN Forces commander in order to enter the DMZ. Korean soldiers who have permits to enter the DMZ carry badges that say Civil Police in Korean. In accordance to the Armistice Agreement, soldiers carrying weapons are not allowed into the DMZ, so the designation of Civil Police. On a side note, North Korean soldiers who enter the DMZ are also called the same, but in another name. Since the ceasefire, no human being has been allowed into the DMZ except those engaged in military activities. Ironically, it is such control and restriction that have changed the DMZ area. Unlike the rest of South Korea that has been extensively developed and ecologically damaged, the DMZ has gone through a great restoration. Due to limits on development in the DMZ for 60 years, the battle-torn land naturally restored itself during that time. The east-high, west-low terrain of the Korean peninsula can be well observed in the DMZ area. There are wetlands, coasts, flat plains, mountain ranges, and marshlands between the west and east coast. More than 2,700 plant and animal species, along with 103 endangered species, inhabit the DMZ. While only comprising 1.37% of the nation's land, the DMZ supports more than 50% of all indigenous species of Korea. These figures are quite surprising in light of the fact that the DMZ is full of landmines. In addition, the only eco-corridor that spans from east to west in the country is the DMZ and the Civilian Control Zone. The Baekdu Mountain Range and wetland on the west coast intersect with the DMZ area. This creates a habitat for wildlife such as the Asiatic black bear, goral, musk deer, and other large mammals. The east coast of South Korea boasts beautiful scenery, and the thick forests and rocky terrain of the central and eastern areas are an ideal habitat for large mammals. On the DMZ's western side, there are pristine wintering grounds and breeding grounds for migrating birds at the mouth of the Han River and nearby islands. The ecological importance of the DMZ is gaining attention domestically as well as internationally. The ecosystem of the DMZ is one of the few in the world that was naturally restored and must be protected for the sake of humankind. Historically, the DMZ sits in an area that was once fought over by the kingdoms of Baekje, Goguryeo, and Silla. Northern forces fought the southern kingdoms, resulting in not only war but also cultural exchange. Remnants of the buildings that were built after the Japanese occupation and the horrors of the Korean War are dotted around the region. Panmunjom and secret underground North Korean tunnels are located on the DMZ too. So ancient history and more recent developments coexist in this corridor. The DMZ area is one huge historical site in itself. Uninterrupted lines of fence extend from the east coast to the west coast of the Korean peninsula. At the turn of the 21st century, the cold relations between the two Koreas began to thaw. North-South summit meetings were held. The rail tracks on the east coast and the western side were reconnected. South Koreans were able to travel to Mount Kumgang by passing a land route through the southern limit line. The Gaesong Industrial Complex was built in collaboration, and trucks loaded with raw materials and finished products run back and forth the border. But recently, the North-South Exchange and Cooperation Program has been stalled due to rising tensions between the two Koreas. In such times, we must act wisely. While assessing the prevailing conditions on one hand, we must also watch China, Japan, the US, and Russia closely. It is up to Korea to solve its own problems. While it is much easier to solve a problem with help from a foreign ally, once the problem is gone, the ally will usually stay put. This has occurred again and again in history. The division of North and South Korea was caused by outside powers, but mending the division is now Korea's responsibility. Obviously, no foreign country will be willing to reunify the two Koreas. Like an early morning tide, the reunification of Korea might come sooner than anticipated. Thus, we must prepare ourselves for the day when reunification happens. If we vacillate, then reunification might slip through our fingers or perhaps even get taken away by outside forces. For the sake of reunification in the future, we need to revisit the value of the DMZ. The Korean DMZ symbolizes war, confrontation, hatred, and killing. But ironically, because of that, it can become a high ground for peace, life, exchange, and cooperation. Division is the root of every kind of pain and grief. War that results from the division among human beings and destruction of nature that results from the division between human beings and nature can be healed by life. In order to achieve reunification, we need to have a clear mission that takes into account the internal and external circumstances. A systematic and well-organized plan must be put in place. Our stated goal must be establishing a united and new civilized nation that is based on peace and life. In order to attain such a reunification, we must be more empowered, and South Korea must be integrated inside, accept North Korea with open arms, and work with the United States, the United Nations, and China. Since 1998, the Korea DMZ Peace Life Valley has carried out initiatives supporting training, surveying, and regional cooperation that will be needed for the peaceful and life-oriented transition of the DMZ area. By partnering with the international community, the organization aims to turn the DMZ into a breeding ground for humanity's everlasting values, peace, and life. The Korea DMZ Peace Life Valley holds 160 international awareness programs and peace life reunification programs a year, with some 6,000 students, teachers, soldiers, and others from Korea, and 40 other countries. The DMZ, where peace and life nurture. The DMZ will be reborn as an agent of change to make peace, not war, to reunify a nation instead of standing divided, to replace aggression with cooperation, to facilitate communication instead of closure, to support life, not death, and to buttress restoration and prevent destruction. A land of peace, life, and culture. This is the future image of a unified Korea, and it begins at the DMZ.